Good evening. I'm Dan Sheely, and I'm the director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture. I'm also the executive director of the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, or PRUX. On behalf of the PRUX program and the Collegium Institute, as well as on behalf of the Pontifical Council for Culture, it's my honor to welcome you to tonight's event, Laudato Si at 5 years, towards an ecology of culture. 5 years ago, Pope Francis visited Philadelphia for the World Meeting of Families. On the Friday that he arrived, the entire University of Pennsylvania shut down, with the exception of the Penn Museum, for the sake of one event that it was hosting, an event that was considered distinctively important. And that was a conversation on Laudato Si that Collegium assembled together with the new Penn program in Environmental Humanities, PPEH. 5 years later, tonight, we're pleased to be back together with PPEH and many others, this time through a digital venue for round 2. The Collegium Institute, as many here know, draws our university community into conversation with the Catholic intellectual tradition. And it does so, especially to promote reflection on the Catholic, that is, universal or truly large questions that shape human life. That means that we're engaging and re-engaging with Laudato Si, not just because it is a papal encyclical, but because a proposal for the care of our common home necessarily confronts us with pressing, if not ultimate, questions about our common life as well. And we must continue to address these questions, not only within a community of faith, but with all who participate in our common life and share our common home. In helping us to promote this conversation, we would also like to thank our many co-sponsors, including the Lumen Christi Institute, the Yale University Forum on Religion and Ecology, America Magazine, the Jesuit Review, Comment Magazine, and the Villanova University Office of Mission and Ministry. I'll now turn things over to my colleague, Terrence Sweeney, our theologian and scholar in residence, in order to focus our discussion and to present our distinguished and interdisciplinary panel. Welcome, Terrence.
Good evening. When I was preparing my opening remarks, I realized that tonight's lineup has something of the makings of a kind of corny joke. A bishop, a philosopher, and an architect, and an artist walk into a bar. The idea of the joke, admittedly not all that funny, got me thinking, why such an eclectic lineup? Pope Francis in Laudato Si gives us some clues. In the face of a grave ecological crisis, he writes that we still lack the culture needed to confront this crisis. Francis indicates many of the technical, technological, and political means of addressing the environmental crisis, but he insists that what is needed is more. We need an ecological conversion to build up what he describes as an ecological culture marked by care for our common home. For this, we need to recognize that, quote, solutions will not emerge from just one way of interpreting and transforming reality. We cannot continue to think that the market, the scientists, or the government will solve these problems for us. All three of these are needed, but we need to understand that we are faced with a crisis, which is both social and environmental. Thus, we need to bring to bear all facets of our social and cultural lives. And so in this encyclical, he speaks of the need to develop our faith and spirituality within the Catholic Church and amidst all people of goodwill, as Bishop Paul Tai and the Pontifical Council for Culture work to do. We need to reconsider the layout of our cities, the architecture of our buildings, our relationship to agriculture, and the very shape of our lives. We need something like the new urbanism developed by architects like Philip Bess. We need to hone our ethical resources to redefine our notion of happiness, to get beyond a kind of vision of perpetual material progress to something like what philosopher Kate Soper calls an alternative hedonism. We need to realize that beauty, art, and making are not options in response to the ecological crisis, but ways of building up a culture of care, as Makoto Fujimura does in his art and writing. In other words, we need to listen to these four people. And so it is my honor to introduce our speakers tonight. Our first speaker, Bishop Paul Tighe of Ireland, is the Secretary for the Pontifical Council for Culture. Philip Bess is a professor of architecture at the Notre Dame School of Architecture and author of Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architecture, Urbanism, and the Sacred. Kate Soper is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at London Metropolitan University, author of the recent book, Post-Growth Living, for an Alternative Hedonism. And Makoto Fujimura is an artist and also an author of the just-released book, Art and Faith, A Theology of Making. I think if we listen to these speakers tonight, we may get a deeper sense of just what we need for a more ecological culture. It's my honor to hand over the Zoom screen to Bishop Paul Tighe.
Hi, good evening, everybody, or it's good evening here, good afternoon with you. As Terence said, one of the really important things about Laudato Si is that it's a document written by the Pope, but written by the Pope not just for Catholics, but for the global community. It's an essential part of the Pope's approach to the environmental issues, to say these are issues on which all human beings have to work together, or else we won't have a future together. So that very important point, I think, is to the audience here is all of us. The Pope has something to say, particularly insights that are shaped by the Catholic social teaching, by the Judeo-Christian approach to ethics, but also an admission that we need more than that. We need the insights of different perspectives of people from different religious traditions and none, so we can work together to find solutions to problems that we all have to confront. When I think about Laudato Si, I always find myself trying to, at some levels, it's a deceptively simple document. It's a document that speaks clearly in simple language, but there's a lot going on. For me, to give it a kind of a framework that helps me, I think of it in terms of a medical analogy. When I have a problem, a medical problem, I go to a doctor, and if my doctor is a good doctor, he or she will be inclined to listen to me, look at the presenting symptoms, and I think that's part of what Laudato Si does. It looks at the presenting symptoms about some of the sickness of our environment, but it looks also for the underlying causes. Then perhaps has to draw me into a recognition what the real problems are. And then he or she will prescribe certain medicinal approach and also probably lifestyle change. And I think all those are involved here. On the diagnosis, I think it's very clear in this document that the Pope recognizes very clearly the most obvious presenting symptoms of the environmental degradation we see all around us. Water quality, loss of biodiversity, but he's particularly interested on the impact on the poor, those who are suffering perhaps disproportionately what's happening. In terms of looking at the underlying causes, the Pope is very quick to kind of put his finger on the risk and the problems associated with consumerism, particularly a type of consumerism that doesn't seem to recognize any limits. A consumerism that, as he says at one stage, wants everything and wants it now. A consumerism that is even promoted by many of the commercial companies we deal with. So it's not simply that we have these needs are to some extent invented for us and made for us. So there's a consumerism he recognizes problematic. Allied to that is a type of individualism, everybody thinking of his or her own interests, not just at the level of individuals, but also societies and sections within societies and nations, thinking only of their own immediate and strategic interests. Part of that too is perhaps a failure on behalf of the human race to recognize that the earth is our home. We are part of a created reality. We are part of something that is bigger than us. The earth is not just a raw material that we use for our own satisfaction and to meet our own needs. Very important here is the Pope revisits the Judeo-Christian understanding of creation, understanding that to human beings has been entrusted the stewardship of this world, not simply a blind mastery, but a stewardship to take care and to look after this world, a world in which we are at home and a world on which we depend. I think that's an insight. The Pope is very clear in that's also something that's maybe found particularly in non-scientific and non-Western traditions, that we have to be open to that understanding of seeing the world as something sacred, as something to be valued, as something that has its own point and purpose. I think in the effort, like a good doctor, to confront us with this, the Pope recognizes that the world in many ways has been willfully blind to the problems we're confronting. It's too easy to be distracted. It's too easy to create divisions. It's too easy to manipulate information. But he's calling for us to confront honestly the realities that are shaping our world. He's calling us, and particularly to recognize maybe that consumerism is not just damaging the earth, but consumerism as a way of human living is destroying human beings. It's fracturing the solidarity that should be part of our relationship between each other. In moving on to more a prescription of what he feels has to be done, of the approaches we need, I think the Pope is very clear that we need the contribution of scientists, we need the contribution of economists, we need the contributions of politicians, but we need the contribution of each and every section of society, that we work together to recognize and to be honest about the difficulties we confront, to work together in ways that think about the needs not just of ourselves, but of our broader community, and that think about, particularly it's interesting, the word that keeps repeating in the document is dialogue. The Pope sees the need for a dialogue between the different sections in society so that we're open and honest with each other. I think this is something that probably emerges even more strongly in the Pope's most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, where he is very clear that the fact of being brothers and sisters in this world is not just an accident. It's not just something we have to accept or tolerate, but that it's our destiny. We were created in the image and likeness of God. We were made for community. We either resolve our problems appreciating the diversity that we have as a richness, or else we're going to run into problems and we will never confront the fundamental problems. The final thing I think the Pope does, like any good doctor, is moves on to not just the issues of what medications are required or what surgery might be needed, but asks us to confront honestly how we need to revisit our lifestyles, how we need to revisit, have a more preventative strategy. I think particularly on that is he highlights the importance maybe of developing a more simple lifestyle, to live with less, recognizing that consumerism, while it seems very attractive, in many ways can be destroying us as individuals, and that there's probably something that some commentators call a sweet spot of where we can find a less consumeristic way of living that will ultimately be more rewarding. I've been taken recently by somebody I've been reading, Jason Hickel, who talks about the need for sacrifice, for people to be willing to sacrifice some of the advantages they have in this world, particularly people in the Western and more developed parts of our world. And word of sacrifice, I think, is important here. That's one that people from religious traditions would maybe recognize as a need for conversion. And that is a type of ecological conversion, that we live our lives reflecting more intentionally on how our choices are impacting the earth, are impacting other people, and we try and live that with hope. I think when we talk about sacrifice, Yeats always said, too much sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. I think we recognize we need to offer hope and vision and a way of living that people would see as attractive, as going to be more attractive, and as offering a better way and a more sustainable way of living. Two final points. One is, I think, very important, is the Pope is very true about the importance of beauty, that we learn to appreciate beauty. If we don't appreciate beauty, then he says we will appreciate nothing. So therefore, the need to reflect on how we give people an understanding of beauty, which is not focused on utility or on what we can produce, but is celebrating beauty as something that is gratuitous, something that is gracious, that is given to us automatically. And then I think related to that, I would want to think that's why I look forward to the interventions of the artist and the architecture. And then finally, I think I want to talk about a spirituality. an approach to living that is more simple, that is intentionally more simple, that tries to take account of the needs of others, that tries to see creation as something good, that practices a kind of sense of thankfulness and appreciation, that deliberately seeks in different ways to grow an appreciation of the earth as a gift to us, as something that sustains us. And that's why Pope Francis is continually drawing on the example of Saint Francis as somebody who had that mystical understanding of creation as the place in which we can find God and seeing God in the goodness of his creation. So I think there's some initial pointers I'd like to offer. I'd now look forward to listening to Philip, who is going to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Ty. And thank you everyone for coming. Laudato Si locates itself within the tradition of modern Catholic social teaching. That tradition began with Leo XIII's 1891 Rerum Novarum, the first of a succession of papal encyclicals both occasioned and necessitated by the rise and reverberations of modernity. And it is that body of church teaching to which Laudato Si has been added. Modernity here denotes the ongoing worldwide transformations wrought by the Industrial Revolution that has in turn precipitated not only various political revolutions and the sexual revolution, but also a global environmental crisis that is the specific focus of Laudato Si. Francis is adamant about their interrelationship, repeating throughout that in both the natural environment and the man-made world, quote, everything is connected, end quote. And he cites his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who has contended that both the natural environment and the human social environment have been damaged by an erroneous understanding of human freedom as limitlessness, quoting Pope Benedict, where we ourselves have the final word, where everything is simply our property and we use it for ourselves alone. The misuse of creation begins when we no longer recognize any higher instance than ourselves, when we see nothing else but ourselves, end quote. Consistent with Christian scripture and tradition, and supported by arguments drawn from both reason and revelation, the fundamental anthropological assumption of Laudato Si is that man is most truly understood as an intermediate being, both part of and transcending the natural order. This mediating status affords human beings both objective privileges and objective obligations of stewardship. But our stewardship obligations are hampered by a strong and pervasive obstacle. In paragraph 66, Francis writes, quote, "The creation accounts in the book of Genesis suggest that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. According to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin," end quote. Now, to say that human beings are part of the natural order is to say that we are a certain kind of animal. Classically, a kind of animal that in different circumstances employs productive, practical, and theoretical reason by means of which we participate in nature. We are always acting upon the natural order by and within which we are both sustained and constrained. We err in imagining that either nature or man is complete. And we err again in imagining that either nature or man is simply benign. Human well-being, both individual and communal, requires us to use nature prudently, to understand nature well, and to intervene in nature cautiously. At the same time, our too often, too dimly perceived divine vocation as stewards challenges us to act upon and behave toward nature generously. Let it never be said that it's not a hard thing to be an intermediate being. Our capacities include both the ability to improve nature and the ability to spoil it. But the very language of improvement and spoliation implies a source of value that can only come from outside of nature itself, an implication graspable by unaided reason, but arguably more clearly elucidated by Christian revelation. Human flourishing requires us to understand and respect simultaneously the nature within which we are embedded, the reality of nature within ourselves, and the nature of reality beyond ourselves. The good news of the Christian gospel is that in Christ, the ruptures to creation caused by sin can be healed, including ruptures in our relationship both to one another and to the natural order in which we are embedded. And that by turning to God and seeking his help, we are able with divine aid to better fulfill the stewardship responsibilities that in the modern era we have largely neglected or forgotten. Grace perfects nature, the church teaches, not thwarting nature's inherent character and constraints, but rather bringing nature to its proper completion. Not wanting to seem unmindful of the future of either the earth or the human race as a whole, I want to put on my subsidiarity hat here and conclude with some specific thoughts about human ecology at a less than global, even less than national, but greater than a building scale. There's a long tradition of thinking about cities, to which I'm partial, that identifies cities as the primary locus of human flourishing, a tradition of which the Christian faith is part in both its sacramental and eschatological dimensions. So I want to touch ever so briefly upon earthly cities and beauty, and earthly cities and justice. And this because we don't generally think about contemporary city making in terms of either beauty or justice. But I think the drift of Laudato Si is that we should. But first, a prologue. It is impossible to understand any city without recognizing it as a collective human artifact over time that it is in our nature to make. It's comprised of several simultaneously interrelated and reciprocal orders, specifically a demographic order, the people who are one of the city's essential material causes, an environmental order, how its citizen animals occupy their natural landscape, an economic order, the way the city's residents produce and exchange material goods, a moral order, both the laws that constrain its citizens and the character ideals that inspire them, and a formal order, its patterns and dispositions as a physical artifact, and also the city's other primary material cause. Now, because the formal order of cities is a body of expertise belonging to architects of a certain training and disposition, I would say more at this point about the formal order of good cities, about how and why they are not only beautiful, but also resilient and environmentally sustainable. But I'm running out of time. So I want to mention instead briefly 4 things about the formal order of traditional cities. First, they contain a proximate mix of life activities, both mundane and ceremonial, located within a comfortably walkable distance. Second, they are a hierarchical environment of public spaces, most prominently streets and squares, beautiful streets and squares, as part of a public realm belonging to rich and poor alike. Third, there is a hierarchy of public and private building types, with civic buildings more prominent and private buildings less so. And fourth, they are generally made with locally sourced and low embodied energy building materials, which tend to make traditional urban environments both more durable and more resilient. Now, at this point, I would usually want to show some slides, but since I am running out of time, let me instead suggest that after this event is over, go home and do a Google search for YouTube clips of the opening scenes of 3 Woody Allen movies, 1979's Manhattan, 2011's Midnight in Paris, and 2012's To Rome with Love. Be sure to Google the opening scene of each movie and not the trailer. These are by no means perfect movies, and equally compelling scenes could be assembled for good urbanism at the scale of smaller cities and towns, for example, in Bruges. But the opening scenes and the cities they depict are made with love, and they cover a multitude of sins. Finally, in regard to justice and the built environment, it is a sad truth that our contemporary culture of building is in such disarray that in most places in this country, it is literally illegal to build beautiful traditional towns and city neighborhoods. And in those places where it is legal, it is often prohibitively expensive. And these circumstances are in part a product of a bad building culture, but they are also in part a product of bad positive law. In particular, bad zoning law that separates uses and bad property tax law that punishes landowners who improve their property and rewards landowners who do not improve their property by not taxing their unimproved land. So the question is, what would good positive law look like that would facilitate beautiful and affordable urban environments? These, of course, are all big topics, and we are required to address them at a time in which we are free of neither our finitude nor our selfish nature, and in which our bad ecology, both natural and human, makes it especially hard for us to speak to and listen to one another. Nevertheless, as Laudato Si says, everything is interconnected. Laudato Si invites all people of goodwill to seriously ponder the theological and anthropological propositions therein. But those of us who are Catholics are obligated to do so, to trust in God and to both look for and be a means of Christ's presence in the world in this historical moment. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kate Sober.
Hello, and good evening to everybody. Probably the first point I should make to you is that I'm speaking to you not as a religious person, but although that's the case, I do regard the church as being at times in advance of secular culture in its argument on politics. And I think this is nowhere more evident than in Laudato Si. The encyclical strikes me as being fundamentally correct and most impressive in the way that it brings together themes that I regard as absolutely of central importance in any argument on the global ecological crisis. And I just want to run through these. In the first place, there's the emphasis throughout on the role of poverty and the unequal exchange of resources in the creation of the crisis, and on the need, therefore, to overcome inequality, both nationally and internationally, as a condition of any truly sustainable resolution of the crisis. Secondly, there's its recognition of the role of a too exclusively profit and growth-driven economy in the creation and persistence of this crisis, and the need, therefore, to address the more structural and systemic aspects of the global economic order. Thirdly, and relatedly, there is a critique running through the encyclical of our blind reliance on technology and technical fixed approaches to crisis resolution. The argument is not Luddite, it's not a blanket projection of the role of technology, but the encyclical rightly claims that to look to technology alone is to remain within an essentially instrumental and profit-oriented mindset, and thus to treat symptoms and not causes. And fourthly, and emerging as a kind of summation of all these themes, there is the attention paid to the need for an alternative culture, a revision of thinking on progress and prosperity as the prior condition of political change. Much stress is placed on the adoption of a new lifestyle, We cannot, it is said, continue with current models of production and consumption, nor with the current subordination of politics to the economy and the economy to technological rationality. And this is a form of address, let us note, that seeks to transcend political divisions. The appeal is to the community of humanity at large. It's an appeal for global solidarity in meeting a common crisis. And that's a point that all of us seem to be noting about it. And it's very important, I think. As so stated, these themes obviously remain abstract. Their implications for more concrete politico-economic policy and practice need to be elaborated, but they together comprise a crucially important statement of intent, better than any, I think, that has come out of our politicians, and as such, I fully endorse them. What I want to do in the remainder of the time here is simply to point to one or two ways in which I might qualify the argument or think its argument could be further advanced, that it could lend itself to the creation of this ecological conversion or a new culture of prosperity. And my first point here, I think, relates to the message on work, since here I feel that too much priority may be given to the need for universal employment at the expense of acknowledging the links between the consumerist growth economy and the dominance of the work ethic within current culture. In my own view, market-driven consumption should now be seen for what it has largely become. That is, a means of further extending the global reach and command of corporate power at the expense of the health and well-being of both the planet and the majority of its inhabitants. But as the exploitations of the extractivist industries and sweatshops in the poorer countries that serve affluent consumption in richer societies grow more extreme, and the future of work in the affluent nations themselves becomes more precarious and exposed to automation-driven job loss, a main focus, I think, has to be on rethinking the centrality of the work and spend way of living, on restoring more autonomous ways of working and living to the peripheral economies, and on moving to a more reproductive rather than expansionary and constantly innovative way of providing for our more material needs. And a lot of that, I think, is indeed consistent with what Pope Francis is arguing himself. So instead of fearing the end of work, I think we need to view it as an opportunity to provide more free time while reducing the environmental footprint. In other words, to move from a work-rooted understanding of identity, purpose, and self-fulfillment to one that is life-centered and revolves around more self-provision and self-chosen ways of spending time and energy. There's also, I think, a potential here for a less techno-driven culture, one that could combine reliance of very smart technologies in some areas, such as medicine, energy, for example, with a return to more traditional and sustainable ways of doing and making, and the use of more artisanal methods. Hybrid technical approaches of this kind would seem to chime with Pope Francis's advice to tread, and I think he's right here, to tread some kind of golden mean in respect of our recourse to technology. On the issue of consumerism, while agreeing on the papal critique, I might want to emphasize here not only the need to be more responsible and altruistic in our attitude to consumption, but also to stress the pleasures of adopting an alternative lifestyle. Indeed, in my argument around alternative hedonism, I point to the many downsides of affluence, the insecurity, the ill health, the stress, the time scarcity, the excessive waste, the loss of community, the traffic congestion and pollution, the commercialization of children, and so forth. All these are negative aspects, I think, of the consumerist lifestyle, even for those who are most caught up in it. And in my argument around alternative hedonism, I seek to provide a vision of the greater fulfillments, both sensual and spiritual, that we might provide for ourselves by moving to a less fast-paced and acquisitive lifestyle. In that context, I also cite existing indices of disaffection with their consumerist culture on the part of many affluent consumers themselves, and present that as lending some support for a more general green renaissance. And I argue relatedly that people on the whole are more likely to act on climate change if offered the enticement of other more enjoyable ways of living than would be the case if they're confronted only by apocalyptic warnings on the dangers of climate change. So what I'm suggesting here then, in short, is that even as we make the plea that Pope Francis does himself very poignantly for a less selfish response on consumption, we can also, I think, appeal to a measure of self-interest in shifting to a more sustainable order, and in doing so avoid an overly ascetic vision of green living. And this brings me to a last comment here, which relates to my own sense of spirituality as being an aspect of self-fulfillment and cultural enhancement that should not be deemed exclusively religious in character. Where I appeal to spirituality in my argument on alternative hedonism, I'm not implying that a less acquisitive consumption need find its basis in religious belief or ascetic practice, although I don't think it would necessarily exclude that at all. But I think, I'm only implying that it will be less driven by the quest for accumulating stuff, more socially and environmentally aware, and more engaged with the pleasures of art, craft, and sociable living. It will be distinguished by its emphasis on neglected sources of enjoyment and indulgence, more outgoing, more generous and convivial, less narcissistic, and not by the cultivation of inwardness and personal austerity, sometimes found in the tradition of religious asceticism, and which I think influences some of those who reject contemporary materialism. And here I think there's nothing particularly unusual in valuing these more spiritual gratifications above those supplied through commercial transactions. After all, they are often defined approvingly as precisely those which money can't buy. Consumer culture, in fact, can in this sense seem perversely ill-suited to supplying these more spiritual needs and desires, or those often claimed as the most spiritual. And it can make good the deficit only in a partial and inadequate way. In other words, by deflecting spiritual yearnings onto forms of material acquisition. Policies informed by an alternative hedonist turn to the spirit would seek to address that kind of imbalance and to restore sources of direct well-being that have been sacrificed to the commodifying logic of consumer culture. And at that point, I think my time is up, and I am going to hand over now to Makoto Fujimura.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for inviting me, an artist, into this conversation. Very important conversation, and I, as an artist, have been thinking a lot about the connection between ecology and culture. I wrote a book called Culture Care, which came out of years of meditation as an artist navigating in the larger political world as well as culture reality. Culture is now culture wars. And I wanted to propose an alternative path, an antidote to culture wars, which is what I call culture care, a generative way of thinking and living that is basically based on Galatians 5 passages of St. Paul writing about the fruit of the Spirit being love. And then the extension of that love being joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, and gentleness and self-control. I wondered to myself, as an artist, what I'm trying to do is to reflect God's beauty into the world and into my life. And because God is love, as Bible speaks about, that as the fundamental reality of God, I wonder to myself, how is that manifested in our lives, in our communities, in our churches, in political realities, and in our culture at large. And my answer to that formed, or my frustration with the gap between what we preach in churches and the reality of culture at large. And this creates many problems, but one is a series of false dichotomies that are created that pits one against another, and certainly creates this divisiveness in culture. I have always said that culture war will culture war rhetoric will lead to real wars. And we've seen that reality manifests itself in the US Capitol this week. So where do we go from here, and where's the artist's role in this? And today I wanted to simply share an example of way two artists have been working to create kind of an ecology around this connection between the reality of where nature is crying out in our time, and how we might connect those ecological strains to create a language that moves toward beauty and moves toward love. The works behind me, my works, monumental works called Walking on Water. I am here in my Princeton studio, and I have been working on these paintings since the 2011 tsunami and great Tohoku earthquake and nuclear disaster that followed in Japan. And we celebrate, or we commemorate, the 10th anniversary of that this year. I also happen to be a ground zero resident in New York City. I lived 3 blocks away from where the tower stood before I moved to my current place, farmhouse in Princeton. And so I met a musician soon after 9/11, 2001. So we celebrate the 10th anniversary of 3/11 tsunami, and 20th anniversary of 9/11 this year. Those two are, in my mind, connected in some way in my creative journey. And I met Susie Ibarra, a composer, percussionist, a visionary artist in New York City soon after 9/11. And we have been journeying through various collaborations. And as I began to work on these Walking on Water series of paintings, these paintings are done with pulverized minerals on polished canvas, on very large canvases. But Susie began to respond with her music, and I commissioned her to do a series of work in response to my work. And the work that you see behind me is a work that I did this summer in response to her music. So there is a cyclical way that this has produced both of our music and art. So I will share that on my screen here, and and I created a short montage of what we have done. And Susie, as a visionary, she went to Himalayan hills to record with her underwater microphone the sound of glaciers breaking apart and melting. And so these are literally cries of the earth turned into her composition. As a jazz percussionist and a composer, she has created music that capture the cries of the earth. And I am responding to her with these walking on water pieces. So let me share that with you now. In my new book, Art and Faith, Theology of Making, which is out of Yale Press, just came out, I speak about how somatic knowledge, knowledge that is based on making, is what we need to pursue in integrating the knowledges that we have through sciences, through scholarships, through academic work, necessary work. And so in concluding this time, I am honored to be an artist who is wrestling to do that every day in my studio, but journeying with other artists like Susie to be able to bring many of the senses together in order that we can create toward that city that is being made alive through the spirit, through human creation. And Susie and I have discussed this finally on our podcast, Culture Care Creative Podcast. So if you listen to that podcast, you can find out more about the intuitive mysteries that are opened up when two artists collaborate. But in concluding, I want to suggest that ecological care, as the Pope has suggested, requires culture care. The problem, at least in America, is that care for our environment has been hijacked by culture wars, and therefore it is automatically created, slotted into these forced dichotomies and binaries that does not allow for the integrative whole to appear as something that is beautiful for all humanity to thrive under. So we need culture care, and we need poets and musicians and artists to be able to create a environment where we can talk about human thriving without getting hijacked by cultural language. So thank you. And I believe we're going into Q&A now.
Yes, we could ask our panelists to turn their cameras back on, if those are off, and unmute themselves. I would note for all of you in attendance that you should be able to see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a little box that says Q&A. I see 2 of you already have. So you can feel free to put some questions in there. The briefer they are, the easier it is for us to kind of process and read, and we'll try to use some of those questions as the conversation develops. So again, that's right at the bottom of your screen for Q&A. But it's my honor to ask some of the first questions. And I wanted to, my first question actually is, I guess, targeted towards Kate and Paul. I found in some extent in both of your talks, questions of altruism or finding a more rewarding life, questions of sacrifice, but questions of also kind of a deeper account of happiness. And I wondered if you could speak to how maybe developing a sense of both, a sense of sacrifice and altruism, combined with a sense also of a more rewarding life. How thinking those two things together can help us develop a better culture of ecology.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Yes, well, I think my own position here would be that we need to develop both a sense of altruism, of looking after others, of curbing our own more acquisitive and egoistic instincts, while at the same time, I think it's quite important if we're going to develop an alternative sense of prosperity and to build a culture around that as a first step to more political changes that are needed. But we also need to appeal to the kind of pleasure and gratification that can come through adopting a less selfish way of living. So for me, these two aren't exactly antithetical, really. I mean, I think that what's been neglected in our time and for over several decades now, really, has been the pleasures that come from feeling yourself to be part of a community, to have a more citizenly, Republican attitude to the social whole, to even recognize that there is a social whole with one's own responsibility and accountability towards it. I mean, for a very long time now, I think the emphasis has been placed on the individual, and particularly narrowly on the individual as consumer. And that's true not only in, by advertisers and in the market. It's not only a matter of you being addressed essentially as a consumer only when it comes to the marketplace. It's also happened in the development of social policy, where the emphasis falls on thinking of yourself as a consumer, even of welfare services when they're provided and so on. And I think one of the interesting things that happened during the pandemic, during the early lockdown, at least in the UK, was that suddenly, did actually generate a certain sense of community and a lot of volunteering and a lot of neighborly help kind of support and systems and networks developed. And that people actually came to enjoy that and to appreciate what had, in a sense, gone missing from their lives. So I think the short sort of answer here, I mean, obviously we can go on about this in many other ways and in much greater detail, but it would be that we shouldn't go on thinking of these things as separate, that actually being involved in being accountable to our community and developing a less selfish way of consuming is something that can also, redound to ourselves in the form of pleasurable feeling. And very often the kinds of consumption we're thinking about here, for example, this fits in with the vision of alternative cities and so on. I think if we move from a much more car-dominated to a more cycle and walking oriented way of getting around, particularly in the city, then not only do you feel the benefits personally of the better health and less pollution, but you're also, by cutting down on the amount of car congestion, benefiting others as well, and in the process, of course, saving the planet to a degree. So I think very often all these things can go together, and we need to bear that in mind and appeal at that, to that kind of concerted sense of well-being that can come from it.
Yeah, I think just a couple of points. I think pick up on what Kate said about maybe the pandemic as a learning moment for all of us. I think it has certainly helped most of us to think again, what are our real priorities in life? What are the things that are really important to us? Contact with family, being able to meet friends, share simple things, and maybe renewed appreciation. I think also, certainly I lived here initially during the worst of the crisis, and there was a very sense of the common good. A lot of the decisions I had to make and choices I made weren't particularly going to necessarily benefit my own health, but they were going to contribute to the good of a community of which I am part. And I think there was a renewed sense of the common good and how the choices we make are not just choices for ourselves, but are for each other's, and we depend on the choices that others make as well. I think that came home to us. I'd like to see that more as the common good as a value rather than simply as something we have to tolerate. I really appreciated something Kate said, which I think is, I suppose when somebody from a religious tradition begins talking about sacrifice, there is the danger that that is going to be perceived as something more negative or as a denial of the goodness of life. Whereas I think at the best, what I think I loved Kate's term of alternative hedonism. But yeah, I mean, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. So what are the acts and the practices that help us to be fully alive? And I think related to that, I think one of the things as I read the document, I think Pope Francis is almost, to use the language of addiction, staging an intervention. He's trying to say to the world, look, this great prosperity that you, and the consumerism, is not actually making you much happier. It's not even benefiting those who are theoretically the beneficiaries of the inequality. The inequality in our world is disastrous. It is disastrous for the poor. It is disastrous for those who are disadvantaged. But it's not necessarily going to be terribly conducive to the happiness of those who may see themselves at the winning side of the formula.
Exactly.
So I think it's very important that we offer a more positive, I think that's what I liked about what Kate was doing, offering a more positive. And I think from a religious perspective, and forgive me, one of the things I want to try and recover there is we live in a world in which people are expected to produce. They have to deliver their own performance all the time. Whereas at the heart of our Christian message says, no, you are valuable, you have worth, because you are who you are, without all these attachments. So I think that sense of a recovery of the unconditionality of God's love for us, that we're lucky enough to have faith and have belief in a God who loves us first. But the side effect of that then about us learning to be unconditional in our way of celebrating the achievements and the goodness of others, rather than looking to be rewarded and incentives all the time.
Yeah, I was struck in the United States during the height of the pandemic, the first height of the pandemic, alas. Yes, toilet paper was vanishing, but so was yeast for baking bread. A lot of people took up bread breaking. That seems the kind of activity that we need more of, which works well as a kind of a segue question for Makoto and Philip. Both of you speak, of course, of the activities of making. Makoto talking about the theology of making. Philip, the kind of tension between whether or not we work to improve nature or to spoil it. And I wonder, along those lines, like, how can thinking about making in new ways help us develop a more robust culture and a culture more sensitive to the needs of our planet and then the needs of our brothers and sisters on this planet?
Well, I guess one of the things that has struck me about the pandemic is the amount of in-house work, right, that people have been doing on account of confinement, and also in my case, you know, in the neighborhood that I live, I have a neighbor who every Sunday bakes bread and goes up and down the street and distributes a baguette, you know, to everybody. Leaves a baguette on everybody's door. And, you know, one of the things about, you know, thinking about this, how we respond to this, one is those, I mean, one of the things that the pandemic has done is it's really exposed the inequalities, you know, in the society, the people who we depend on, who we don't pay very much, you know, that it's not the wealthiest people who are most exposed and who are doing the kinds of critical jobs that are being done. And it seems to me that an appropriate response to that, aside from thanking them, is for us to actually also become more generous. I mean, there are all kinds of historic disciplines that Christians undertake as individuals and as communities, tithing, you know, being those who are able, right, to be more generous, both with their time and you know, with their work and with their money. It's really kind of underscored how we are all in this together, and it's also underscored the value of you know, being in a place, right? I mean, I feel badly. I'm not in the most walkable neighborhood, but I'm in a walkable neighborhood, and I feel bad for people who are, you know, who require an automobile to get everywhere, and so it kind of underscores for me the importance of, you know, I think of the vocation of those of us who are, you know, involved in the design of the built environment, but it also requires of us things at a personal level. There's something very, very attractive in the history of Christianity about voluntary poverty. That what voluntary poverty, it does a couple of things. One is, I mean, the Benedictines classically, work and prayer and no individual wealth, and you do that for a while, and it turns out that you become rich, right? And the Benedictines, that was the idea, right? It wasn't to become rich, but it was to become rich to give. And so these you know, the Benedictines don't beg, they give, and they're able to give because of the work that they do. And so I think particularly for poor people to have a model of voluntary poverty and work is an extremely important thing to see. You know, how you can live a happy and dignified life, and also it's a method of getting out of poverty. So that's a byproduct, right? It's not the purpose, but it's something that's come out. You know, it's something that's come out in our circumstances that I hope will be a lasting gift, actually, of this very hard year.
Yeah, so let me try to address the connection between making and knowing. My friend of mine who is a clinical psychologist says we learn things bottom up, right, left. So when we are born, we first learn by touch and aroma and taste. And then eventually that information gets trickled up into our brain, and then we feel things first, that goes into the rational realm. So right, left, the affect, the intuitive knowledge comes at the core of our knowledge, but it traverses from bottom up, right, left. And he said, the funny thing is that in our education system, we sit down in a class and take notes. We are forcing information to go left, right, and then we try to go out into the world and actualize what we learned. So we're trying to force knowledge from up down. And same things happening in our churches, I suppose, unless you have a sacramental awareness and the experience of God's presence through the sacrament and so forth. We, especially in Protestant circles, we have definitely segregated knowledge of God into a very rational domain. And part of me writing Theology of Making is as an artist to say that somatic knowledge of experience, of walking in the city, of smelling that bread being made, is fundamental to how we experience God, fundamental to how we experience ourselves, our communities. And therefore, artists and makers, they could be bakers, can play an important role in integrating what has been divided in so many of our categories and seeking knowledge. Not that those things are wrong in themselves, but we need a language toward wholeness. So what I was hoping to show in my, I don't know if the images came through, but I'm painting these images outside and listening to Susie's music. And as later on, the deers came and wanted to literally walk on my paintings because they thought it was like a river. But it was a way for me to understand the ecological crisis, certainly, but the cultural crisis that we're in as an artist, to try to make into that fracture something that is hopefully enduring and beautiful.
I'd like to take some questions now from our audience, as much as I would like to just keep asking you questions myself. But well, the first questions has to do with technological tools, right? So we definitely foregrounding a kind of art and culture and making, but the attendee asks, can the technological tools we have at our disposal, such as social media, help us develop a more ecological culture, or is there something about them that's kind of necessarily a distraction from developing a more ecological culture? And that question is for any of you.
This is an area on which I worked in the past. I used to work in the communications area, and one of my responsibilities was to reflect on what's happening with digital society. I think the tools that we do need a global conversation, and there is a potential for some of the tools we have to help us with that. Having said that, we also have to recognize that these same tools, which theoretically should have been able to underpin the unity of the human family, have served sometimes to fracture and to polarize people so that we don't have rational and helpful conversations. And maybe just a short quote from Pope Francis, where I think he's always very clear, is that good communication is a human rather than a technological achievement. I think if we can make that conversion to committing ourselves to dialogue, to listening to others, to learning from others, then I think the technology will amplify that capacity. If instead we're trying to simply win an argument, make our own point, not dialogue, then that will be made worse by the technology. So I think the technologies create an environment. That environment has been, in many ways, I think, has been poisoned by the type of discourse we have. But one of the issues, I think, within that is for ultimately those environments are created by choices of many different individuals. One thing is that we ourselves try and learn to care for the potential of good communication by being truthful, by being honest, and by avoiding violence and dissension in our way of conversation.
Yes, no, I agree about that. I mean, I think one thing I would add, I think, is if we're thinking essentially about new technology, the internet and the social media exchange and the mass of information, in a sense, that it's provided us all with, then I think it's certainly a double-edged sword, I would say. I mean, on the one hand, I think it is an amazing thing. We wouldn't be able to be having this meeting at all if it were not for it. And it has the potential for very, very positive forms of communication. But I'm also a little worried that people forget that when they're bombarded simply with data, as it were, you're not necessarily developing some of the more thoughtful and reflective and culturally enhancing ways of developing the self. And I think that, in particular, I think that it would be a mistake to confuse having masses of data with actually having developed your understanding. And I think, again, some of the points here that Makoto is making about the importance of making and doing things kind of come into play, because I think that there is a tendency, I think, for us to be rather passive recipients of particularly visual forms, I would say. I worry sometimes that the more literary dimensions have also gone off, that we're no longer kind of attending in the way that we need to the importance of argument, and some of the consequences of that are being felt, I think, politically even now. So we're in a way, we're a very visual culture as a result of it, which is good in some ways, but has it, I think it can come at the cost of more serious forms of communication and greater care with language, I think, and better argument. So there are all these, these two-sided sort of ways of looking at technology, I think, which we need to be aware of.
Part of if we, my sense is that if we're not making something that is beautiful, we become consumers only. And Kate, thank you for addressing that. I tell students that brushes that I use to paint technology. It is it's something that I use for a purpose to fulfill nature into the imaginative creation that I'm trying to accomplish. And by extension, any technology is a tool. Now, my brother is a deep learning expert in Silicon Valley, and so I understand that technology has gotten to a point where it might have crossed a certain threshold of humanity's ability, but it's still, my brother tells me, it is a converging task that data mining can accomplish very fast and better than humans, such as winning a game of chess. That is somebody wins, somebody loses. Therefore, machine can do that much better than humans because of the analysis of all the moves that it can calculate, even beyond the level of human mastery of chess champions. So, but what machines still cannot do is to think generatively, do the divergent task. The university that I attended, that I was speaking to Dean of Engineering, and he said that 10 years ago, a freshman coming into an engineering school had to master the convergent tasks in order to graduate and get a job as a civil engineer. But today you can't do that, because by the time the student masters that, machines can already able to do that better than the student. So it will be a waste of time for students to spend 2 years mastering something that a machine will take over. So the Dean of Engineering is encouraging students to take theater classes and dance classes and learn poetry, because you have to grow in your nimbleness to expand, not to design a bridge in a traditional way, but to ask what a bridge really is. In order to do that, you need Shakespeare and so forth. But this way that we have, the threshold that we have crossed may be that threshold that artists can lead into deeper understanding toward the generative, toward the divergent path. How to think, how do you create something new out of a brush? Artists have been doing that for centuries, and the knowledge base that we have needs to accompany that kind of divergent expansion, that divergent thinking.
Yes.
I find myself worrying about the technology that we have and its impact upon children. That they, from observation, both my own children and my grandchildren who've grown up with this technology, and they just get it instantly, right? I mean, they use it, and they are able to manipulate it in ways that that I'm incapable of, and probably anyone of my generation is incapable of. And yet, there's the question about sort of the emotional maturity, right? That's required for a tool that is that powerful. And so I've had a number of graduate students come through the architecture program at Notre Dame over the last 15 or 20 years who were homeschooled or who had children while they were in school and were homeschooling them. And I think that that's a tremendous, exercise of responsibility that they're doing. And at the same time, I can't imagine that that's a majority option for people. And so the way in which I see a lot of constructive things, inventive things happening on Twitter, but I don't know if it's worth it for what Twitter does. Obviously, I'm not in position to make that call. There is a question too, I think, of just the size of the tech companies and the need to break that down and make it more local. I mean, I think the solution to a lot of this is just more local stuff. Anyway, that's my alarm going off. So I'm gonna mute, and I'm going to stand up and turn it.
Yeah, I was wondering where it's coming from. Another question from the audience has to do about liturgical practice, but I think we can also think of this in a kind of broader sense of liturgical spiritual practice. The question is it helpful to think of liturgy or spiritual life in ecological terms? So in particular, some of the ways we've talked about, like artistic practice, activities of play, pleasurable community practice, or architecture. In what ways can we think of these features as themselves a way of living out liturgical life, or a way of living out our spiritual life?
I think one of the things that certainly in terms of, I smile because I think people who know me well would know liturgy is not a specialization of mine. But at the same time, I think within our liturgies, within our celebrations, there's an Irish comedian who describes liturgy as a very good non-commercial experience. So it's a moment when we set aside from our normal pursuits, and we try and, in a sense, the older idea that it was sort of libation of time. We are setting aside time. We're not using it for something. It doesn't have to earn something. We don't have to be productive. We're actually to be quiet and reflective and to be in the presence of something that is bigger than us. I think that is something that we need to contemplate more and develop more in our own liturgical practices, that there's less need for always having something going on. How do we cultivate a sense of silence? How do we cultivate a sense of listening and appreciation in people? One thing that strikes me very particularly, and it's one of the more practical things that maybe the less formal liturgical practices, but the sense of giving thanks, particularly for food, and giving thanks for food, which is such a blessing in our lives, becoming alert to and more attentive to the people who got it there, particularly in a pandemic, the people who are taking risks by, I think, particularly the people in Central Valley in California, who apparently never had documents until they were suddenly made essential workers, so they could be present and taking risks to ensure, but that we become much more attentive to the chains and to the people who enable us to live as well as we do. And I think a sense of cultivating that sense of appreciation of others, of gratitude, and finding moments of giving thanks for the contributions of people who produce food, people who beautify our world, people who render our lives more worthwhile. I think that's a beginning attitude of being more contemplative and more appreciative.
Yeah, and there are ordinary liturgies as well. There are consumer liturgies like March Madness, or Super Bowl, and we do not. I think we don't realize how much of a liturgical beings we are, even if you're an atheist. We follow certain patterns, and again, if you are not creating something beautiful, as the Christian liturgy can do, to speak of the sacrifice of God in our behalf to make us beautiful. We end up consuming the liturgies created by transactional commercial powers. And the market forces will soon define our liturgies rather than being, us being able to recreate something more profound and beautiful and more enduring back into the world.
There's a lot to be said for good work of all kinds, and I find as coming to the Catholic Church from an evangelical background, one of the things that I found myself grateful for was the structure of the liturgy. And of course, Catholics are notorious for the unevenness of the quality of contemporary liturgy. But I've been fortunate to be involved in parishes and at Notre Dame where liturgy is taken seriously. And I think what I found is so great about that is that the consistent effort to invest care into it is so beneficial, even when I'm not particularly feeling something, right? So that I'm there, things are happening regardless of what my emotional state is. But every once in a while, right, it breaks through. And so that part of the I think that part of the work of life is just being there, is showing up and doing your job and making it possible for others to have those moments. And I've certainly been the beneficiary of those kinds of moments as well. So I'm grateful for people who do that. But it also requires that we go, right, and open ourselves up to that possibility.
This will probably be our last question. And some of it's kind of a combination of two questions that kind of came forward, which is, one was a real challenging question about, the responsibility of the powerful. In this case, the person asking the question really came from thinking about businesses. These are major corporations with certain responsibility. But in another sense, I as a citizen of the United States, a citizen of the most powerful country in the world, myself have kind of power. And so what ways do we have to kind of bear that power more responsibly? And so that, in a sense, combines the second question about stewardship. How do we start thinking, whether we're a doctoral candidate in philosophy like me, an artist, a bishop, an architect, how do we start thinking of that, about the power that we have in various ways, as an act of stewardship, an act of service?
So I want to say that's a really complicated question, because I think that I think that our stewardship involves a lot of different roles. In fact, I mean, the fact that we're participants in nature involves a lot of different roles. I mean, sometimes we are in competition with nature. Sometimes we're eating animals. At the same time, we're taking care of them. At the same time, I mean, one of the things that just astonishes me about what human beings do is when I'm watching some National Geographic program and there are underwater cameras that are recording the teeming life, at the bottom of the ocean. Other species don't do that, right? I mean, we go down and we are trying to understand and we're trying to document it, and it's an act of care and it's an act of wonder, and all of those things are part of who and what we are as human beings. And so it's very hard to say what where you draw lines and what are the roles you play under certain circumstances. But I think that one of the messages that comes through in Laudato Si is to be mindful of this, right? Is to do it. Anything that we do with respect to the natural world, to do it with a sense of care, to do it with a sense of gratitude, to not be cruel, to be generous. All of those kinds of things enter in, and it's not a kind of formulaic thing. I suppose it's something that you either develop good habits or bad habits over the course of a lifetime, and hopefully we develop good ones, and probably we do that in the company of others who are encouraged, right, to be mindful of the privilege and the responsibility of being a human being.
I mean, one of the question I take it about power was essentially addressed to affluent communities. Is that right? I mean, in terms of what it is that they, as being in a relatively privileged place, have to do with their own false power. And I think that, I mean, here, for me, the most important thing that we might begin to do as affluent, so-called developed, in many ways, I think, overdeveloped societies to take on would be to recognize more fully that we should not just assume that we are the model of prosperity and of welfare and the good life. I mean, I think, there's been a sort of sense that the most developed societies, the most economically advanced, are also in a position, in a sense, to offer the sorry, my light's gone out for some reason. Offer a kind of model of the good consumption and the good life. But since, in fact, our environmental footprint is totally unsustainable in a way that makes us much less progressive in point of where we need to get to than more, than less developed societies. I think we need to be more humble in that sense and to recognize that that we have actually arrived at a position in which we should not actually be thinking of ourselves as a lesson to others in terms of development and progress. I mean, I'm not saying that in lots of ways economic development has not proved very beneficial. I mean, in the areas of medicine, in particular, perhaps, obviously there are great advances that have been made, but I think we now should begin to take very seriously the idea that we need to recognize that in certain kinds of ways, less developed nations have got more to teach us than we have properly recognized, and that we should not adopt what I've sometimes called a chronocentric way of thinking. In other words, of thinking that the most developed are these are we can't learn anything from the past or from those who are, in a sense, less prosperous in our own terms. That would be one way in which I think we could become more modest about the way we exercise the notion of first world power, certainly. And I agree with what's been said about stewardship generally as well.
Yeah, stewardship is about love, right? To be able to harness what God has given us through God's gifts, through nature, and lovingly stewarding that for God's glory. And my daughter is a organizational psychologist, and she has been tracking the study on empathy, how empathy level in corporations and companies really do matter. It is one of the least paid attention issues, but some companies are recognizing that the higher the empathy level in your employee, the better you do. You make more money because there are invisible links that are made by empathetic people more than Darwinian survival mode. They are able to extend themselves to exhibit certain qualities that only human beings can provide. And they're more. They can do more than machines. So that is being recognized now in CEOs of companies and so forth. And I hope that is a turn toward a more wiser way of stewarding the power, or power is all relative, but and also we shouldn't forget that each one of us has quite a bit of power to exercise in certainly into our environments, to do what we can to give that loving stewardship into the places that we live in, but also again to ask communally, what is it that we are making? What is it that we want to make? What is the world that ought to be, that we should be educating our children to inhabit and probably, hopefully, that they will be part of creating. So those are part, questions of stewardship that I think about.
Just to finish on a note that picking up from something Makoto said there, many years ago I was involved in a seminar which was looking at geneticism and the development of genetics. And there was one of my colleagues who kept coming up this line, well, we shouldn't try and play God. One of my other colleagues who was equally kind of on our side of the argument, to put it that way, kept saying, no, maybe we should start playing God. That in other words, what we're creating, what we're making, we try and make it good. We try and make it for the benefits of all. We try and think more about the long-term implications of what we're doing, and are we doing things that are not just for our own interest, but are in the interests of others. And I think one of the things that Laudato Si does for me is, I think it's trying to create a constituency for change. There are many politicians who sometimes sacrifice ecological principles because for the short-term political gain, equally commercial companies who are under pressures that are the short-termism with which they have to work. Whereas what this is trying to create maybe a space or an environment that allows people to be the type of people they would really like to be and not being dictated to by short-term interests.
Well, it's my turn to conclude our evening on a note of gratitude. I do want to note Collegium Institute is an ongoing institute with all kinds of activities and events. So just to highlight two upcoming ones. We have our annual Newman Lecture coming up on Friday, February 19th, given by Eamon Duffy. So we'll have another scholar zooming in from the United Kingdom. And then we're also starting a online reading group on Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, which we'll be reading during the season of Lent. I also, as is my obligation, but also a gift, to ask anyone who's able to consider contributing to the mission of the Collegium Institute. You can find on our website the opportunities to donate. We do also do a lot of events focused on giving students at the University of Pennsylvania a chance to deepen their reflection on the humanities. I began my opening remarks with a reference to a perhaps not so funny joke. But of course, jokes are supposed to have punchlines. Well, the punchline may not be all that funny itself, but I think one thing we see tonight and we see in Pope Francis's Laudato Si is the need for love. That an ecology of culture, an ecology that cares for the planet and for the smallest and most forgotten, is one marked by what Francis calls a love which overflows with small gestures of mutual cares, but which is also civic and political and makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. In many ways, the punchline to tonight's conversation is the task of living out some of the things that Pope Francis has spoken of and some of the things that we've spoken of here tonight. And so I hope we can all go do that. And I close with just this note of gratitude to all of you in attendance and to all of our speakers. Have a good night and God bless.
Good.
Thank you.